Thank you. My name is Jackie, use he, they pronouns. I am in my second year of grad school. So what I'm presenting today is the result of 2 years of preliminary fieldwork. And so I've titled this talk Belongings and Dispossessions, Personal Property and Transitional Housing in Los Angeles. When I walk into Marsden, which is a prominent transitional housing facility, I see Pam, Maria's on-site caseworker, flag me down. She brings me into the lobby of the front office and tells me Maria was caught stealing. She starts to tell me more, but stops herself and gestures me through the office door to the side of the front desk. We enter the staff area and sit down in Pam's cubicle. Her expression is stern when she tells me they had her on camera going into multiple dryers and pulling out clothes. For this, she faced immediate discharge from the program. I'm taken aback initially. The idea of her stealing in a manner easily discovered felt out of character. I ask for more details and try to convince them to let her stay if she agrees to return the clothes she stole. We agree on a plan to document the clothes stolen and ask Maria to return them. With Pam, I walk across the length of the compound towards one of the two buildings composed of shipping containers that house people in small rooms, the TV, mini fridge, and a full bathroom. We make it to her door and I knock, prepared to hear the familiar bark of her dog Smoke. When it doesn't come, I try the door and find Maria distraught, tears streaming down her face. She tells me she lost Smokey over the weekend. Maria often spoke of Smokey as the thing that gave her the most hope in her life. She was proud of the way she cared for him and was quick to cry even at the thought of his death or disappearance. I begin to console her, but after a time, Pam opens the door and begins to insist that Maria return the clothes. I try to tell Pam about Smokey's disappearance, but she dismisses me with a wave. I already know that, before returning to her lecture. We don't reach a compromise. Maria is officially exited, as they use the word, and despite several attempts at reversing the decision, we find ourselves in the street outside the compound. We talk about the absurdity of the situation as we wait for her belongings, which eventually come out in huge clear bags, about 5 of them. This is a separate picture. Pam and a few security guards plop the bags on the concrete just outside the gate, and we dig through them looking for her HIV medication. We sift through paintings, stuffed animals, trinkets, and other objects that Maria had lovingly placed in a room to make it feel like home. I grew angry again at the thought that much of this stuff, which had taken her months to collect, would have to be thrown away in order to meet the program limitation of the equivalent of one 60-gallon garbage bag when she transferred to the next site. After we get the location of the intake, we load up all the bags that could fit in my car, leaving the others behind to be thrown away. Buried under a pile of garbage bags in a locker, Maria struggled to stay awake in the backseat during the car. I met Maria about 2 years ago when I was working for a harm reduction organization providing transportation for people to their methadone clinics. She is joyful and playful with a brilliant smile, and she announces quite loudly to people that I'm her son, and revels in the confused looks of people when they try to make sense of an East Asian person and Latino woman as family. She also says that if anybody hurts me, she will kill them, and I desperately hope that doesn't happen. She was initially referred to me as a patient, but it became immediately apparent that she was most concerned with housing. We had spent months working together to get her into this program after her brother-in-law was shot and killed in the RV she was staying in. And she had just been diagnosed with HIV, and her physical disability made it extraordinarily difficult and painful to move around. And she also feared for her safety. She struggled with significant lapses in her memory, sometimes forgetting entire days, and her inability to stay awake during certain periods further compounded these challenges. This made it particularly difficult to adhere to some of the rules enforced in the programs. Since her discharge, I've been with her through 3 additional facilities as she has fought against the draconian policies. Marsden is one facility, and all the other pseudonyms, by the way, is one facility of a complex and ambitious approach to homelessness that Mayor Karen Bass began in 2022 following the questionable success of Project Roomkey, which repurposed hotels and motels during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Inside Safe, as the current strategy is called, purports to bring together a wide variety of state and civil society institutions to extend this logic. So this research comes out of over 2 years of preliminary fieldwork, and during this time I've operated as a driver, transporting patients to their methadone clinics. And I had initially planned on following this thread, tracing the clinical and bureaucratic controls, supporting this highly racialized medical project in light of the advent and growing acceptance of the relatively new player in the medication-assisted treatment world, Suboxone. However, I quickly became involved in the various other goals of my patients, many of which were related to acquiring or maintaining housing, and at the very least related to engaging with very complex and Kafkaesque bureaucratic institutions. Through these experiences, I began to notice a particular aspect of people's journeys that struck me: the role of physical things. These things were central to people's lives, and perhaps because of this were frequent targets of the state's policies. Maria's belongings and the accusation of her taking others' belongings are central to the vignette I presented. I started to wonder, what role do material objects, for example, belongings, bureaucratic documentation, medications, etc., play in the production of the homeless subject, that ever-present yet ill-defined specter, the imagined target of every program? How does the state and its representatives mobilize property as a form of discipline and control? And how do people construct themselves through their material possessions, both in line with and in direct opposition to the state? Ultimately, I contend that the policies of Inside Safe systematically foreclose opportunities for belonging through the management of people's belongings, regardless of the goals and intentions of the individual actors engaged within the program. In severely limiting people's material worlds within facilities, the state and its representatives inevitably discourage the making of home and emphasize the transitional aspect of transitional housing while failing to provide the light at the end of the tunnel. Participants are left in the limbo of a carceral environment that promises much and delivers so little. But I also argue that material possessions are a site for resistance, which I'll go later. Importantly, Inside Safe has had a publicly disastrous rollout. A quick Google News search reveals a fraught narrative that speaks to the deep controversy the program has had since its inception. Visibly violent treatment of unhoused individuals, confiscation and destruction of property, including vital medications, and unfulfilled promises of shelter and security hampered the program's ability to garner confidence and left many feeling that it represented yet another attempt to warehouse and abandon the dispossessed in the context of gentrification and economic exploitation. Indeed, half of those who managed to get permanent housing through the program ended up losing their placement after a year due to the time-limited nature of the housing subsidies. Unable to afford market rate prices for their new apartments, these people were forced back into homelessness. According to most reports and investigations, but not from the mayor's office, unsurprisingly, Inside Safe has failed. Here's a screenshot of the community audit that was run by a coalition of mutual aid groups that has exposed some of the most egregious outcomes experienced by residents. And here you can see that figure again of the 57%. And of the thousands of folks who have been in and out of the Inside Safe program, only 539 have been identified as actually getting housed, 57% of those who have lost it since. A federally mandated external audit released earlier this year points to a pervasive lack of oversight leading to misappropriations and inequitable distribution of funds. And in response to this damning report, LA County decided to dismantle the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, or LAHSA, which was the primary agency responsible for addressing homelessness across the county. And there's a lot of interesting history around how that came to be, which I don't have time to go into. The failure of Inside Safe can be explained when we decenter the official narrative that it is meant to provide permanent housing for people. Like many others, I argue that the creation and maintenance of Inside Safe and similar programs is not offered as an authentic public service to those unhoused, but instead towards the property class who express offense at having to witness the deleterious effects of capitalist excess and violence. Thus, the warehousing of individuals without the end result of permanent housing is perfectly sufficient for the state to achieve its goals. This is why encampment sweeps and dispossession are central to Inside Safe's strategy, or what the mayor's office euphemistically terms move-in days. And if you've ever seen or witnessed a sweep, that feels particularly offensive to term them move-in days. Far from being celebratory, sweeps are violent events in which LA sanitation and often police tear down the structures that people have built for shelter and confiscate the majority, if not all of their belongings, including medications. While Maria entered Inside Safe voluntarily, many others are forcibly uprooted and taken from their surrounding community to be subjected to what Ruth Wilson Gilmore has identified as organized abandonment. Inside Safe and its network of organizations and processes engage in what Chris Herring and colleagues describe as spatial churn, in which the criminalization of houselessness serves to mark unhoused people as perpetually displaceable. I see this process as an inevitable effect of what Ananya Roy has termed a paradigm of propertied citizenship, in which property as a technology facilitates exclusion. Her concept of racial banishment is crucial to understanding how racialized bodies experience state interventions like transitional housing as being located within a matrix of carceral geographies. Consistent with these logics, the apparatus of housing services in Los Angeles maintains what the After Echo Park Research Collective calls the ruse of housing, as a justification for the violent displacement by the state of people sleeping rough. So analyzing bureaucratic language around belongings, I propose that these same concepts of displaceability, spatial churn, and carcerality are relevant in describing material experience. Reproduced here are two segments of official language. The top is a subsection of Los Angeles Municipal Code 5611, which is the code that pertains to the storage of personal property in public space. It attempts to, quote, balance the needs of all of the city's residents, unquote, by establishing a punishable limit on the belongings that unhoused people may possess before that property may be taken away. In this sense, the marking of displaceability is extended to the property of people unhoused. This is a direct extension of marking individuals as displaceable by applying the same logic to their belongings, but it also reinforces that displaceability that is marked on the individuals themselves. The bottom is a line taken from the Inside Safe Program Participant Agreement that governs the allowable amount of property that people may enter a facility with upon enrollment. That they both use the phrase 60-gallon garbage to circumscribe the allowable quantity of possessions is striking and speaks to how the state conceptualizes the material experience of those unhoused. Ironic linguistic consistency that links a punitive code with a program purportedly meant to provide forms of care, though clearly the language in the latter relies heavily on punitive language as well. At one of the facilities that Maria spent a brief 2 months in, they used 60-gallon garbage bins as storage for participants. When participants were evicted, they had 30 days to claim their belongings, after which the garbage bins could be easily wheeled to the street for disposal efficiently. I still think about the ways that I myself devalued Maria's belongings to the point of lapsing on the 30 days when she was exited from this particular facility. She needed me to help transport the remaining bags in her car, but my own adherence to the logic of necessities prevented me from appreciating the meaning she had attached to the various objects that she had bought. I had unwittingly reproduced this logic to the detriment of someone I cared for deeply. And while dispossession operates to force people into acceptance of services and eliminate the visibility of encampments, the further management of belongings serves to modulate participants' experiences of house and home while Inside Safe. This is crucially important as transitional housing continues to look more and more like permanent housing as people wait almost indefinitely for their place. The feeling of belonging in a place is enmeshed in a web of affective, material, political, and social meaning that is commonly separated into the dualism of house and home. Conceptualized as house, it encompasses the material, physical structures and objects of dwelling, while as home, it conjures a swirl of affective, and symbolic meanings we associate with ontological security and kinship. Transitional housing exists at a disjuncture where the potentials for home in this dualism are explicitly foreclosed by state logics of social services, rendering only the materiality of house available to participants in a manner that's reminiscent of Caritas's concept of citizenship in limbo. This access to the materiality of house is further constrained by the policies that are explicitly directed towards belongings. And scholars such as Daniel Miller encourage us to see the affective sphere of home as also encompassing the material objects that we collect and imbue with feelings of belongings. The various objects that we had sifted through that day were part of how Maria constructed home. I turn again to the participant agreement to further explore how the state intervenes on house and home through materiality. Here are 3 policies found within the agreement that I argue explicitly construct a carceral environment that denies the possibility for belonging. When I asked Maria for permission to share these experiences, she explicitly asked me to discuss this first policy, policy number 14, granting facility staff the right to search and confiscate personal belongings at any point for any reason. She was adamant that this ability, in conjunction with the right to enter her room at any point, was profoundly triggering for her and created an environment of fear. Numerous times, she was inappropriately given naloxone during wellness checks when they enter the room without consent, when staff mistook her frequent sleeping spells for overdoses. This would negate the therapeutic effects of the methadone she took, which would send her into withdrawal until she was allowed to receive her once daily dose the following day. She's also experienced staff searching her things while she was not present. And this is in the context of this policy number 19, of this antisocial policy that denies participants the right to entertain any of their own guests. This policy number 22, against alterations and improvements, both severely limits the personal expression so central to a sense of home and belonging, while also preventing sometimes necessary changes. This was the case during the fires, where a participant I spoke with was not allowed to bring in an air purifier despite experiencing severe migraines due to this, as it was considered an inappropriate improvement to the room. And finally, program agreements are quite clear in their assertion that inside safe facilities reside in a certain legal gray area that denies people tenancy rights, even as it operates as a primary domicile for people for months to years at a time. The policies that are specifically focused on belongings and material changes work in concert with these policies that limit agency and establish legal liminality to create an environment that is hostile to constructing home in a sense of belonging. But before moving on, I would like to reflect on what I've only alluded to thus far in this talk, which is the response and resistance of the people living under these violent regimes. Here, I think it's important to understand that the hopes and dreams, the desire for a place of belonging, and the incessant resistance to antisocial policy are always present. Several facilities residents have organized weekly grievance meetings where people come together and share their experiences against the institution. The organization I'm embedded in has begun maintaining a list of violations, a record, and an archive of resistance. Maria herself resists in small ways, by sneaking contraband in and installing subtle alarms that alert her when people enter, even if the alarms themselves don't. She fills her room with items that express her personality and rearranges the furniture in her room to refresh the environment. I think it's important to recognize and name these acts as they are often overlooked and or devalued. Okay, so the documentation thus reviewed constructs a regulatory environment that is preoccupied with the materiality of its items. I turn now to a discussion on the documents themselves and the practices of documentation in Inside Safe. I'll look at 3 examples: the intake form, the verification of homelessness form, and the Homeless Management Information System, or HMIS. I'll end with a discussion on the county's Document Ready initiative that is ironically meant to overcome bureaucratic hurdles, even as it imposes further ones. So this is the intake form. I filled this form out many times, and I've never filled this out the same way twice. So counter to popular narratives of the rationality of bureaucratic institutions, my experiences with performing intakes speak to Michael Hertzfeld's observation that bureaucratic processes retain much of the symbolic considerations of what we consider to be pre-rational processes. I would argue that these processes are profoundly inflected by affective considerations. Filling out this form can be strategic, as when we attempted to expedite the housing of a family believed to be a victim of trafficking by falsifying the form with medical conditions that weren't actually present. And notably, this was guidance we received directly from the LAHSA representative that was assisting us in this process. But this strategy is only possible due to the particular ideologies through which this form is read and interpreted. It requires knowledge of the logics of deservedness that the state establishes through the messy interface of official documentation and the interpretation by actors that is contingent on the particular situation in which it is involved. This process is also deeply inflected by racism and other settler colonial logics that make legible only certain experiences. These examples show the at times contradictory processes that operate both to systematically disenfranchise Black and Brown people, as well as arbitrarily apply bureaucratic rules at the whims of individual actors. So this is the homelessness verification form, and in some ways this form speaks for itself. It codifies and organizes a series of phenomena that become officially associated with what the state has defined as a, quote, homeless individual, and requires a stamp of legitimacy from official actors. This is another form I've filled out many times and has been a particularly annoying bureaucratic hurdle, as it is required for every intake, regardless of whether it was filled out before. Again, this fits into broader projects of the construction of deservedness and points to the well-documented obsession of the US welfare system with fraud to the detriment of its recipients. The fact that I have to fill it out every time is slightly difficult to understand, given the implementation of an electronic record-keeping system for people who are unhoused. The Homeless Management Information System, or HMIS, is a software tool that operates much like an electronic medical record, in which data is stored revolving around an individual, a client. Like an EMR, it claims legitimacy as a neutral platform for documenting events and tracking progress. But also like an EMR, it ultimately is a site of contestation, where particular narratives are invoked for strategic purposes. Whenever I worked with a LAHSA employee to facilitate Maria's transfers, invariably, they would react with surprise when pulling up her profile. Quote, "She's been in the system a while," end quote, they would say. And I heard this exact phrase from at least 2 people. In one instructive moment, an employee reviewed the documentation immediately leading up to the eviction I recounted at the beginning of this presentation, and commented that it seemed like, quote, "somebody had been building a case against her," end quote. This is quite similar to the experiences I and probably many of you have had on the wards, where various clinical actors strategically construct narratives through progress notes for particular purposes, such as advancing discharge. Finally, I turn to another example of bureaucratic absurdity, which is Document Ready. So Document Ready is a county-wide initiative aimed at streamlining the process of bureaucratic documentation for housing eligibility. It reduces the necessary paperwork to a handful of documents that are all primarily related to legal identity, such as a birth certificate, identification card, social security card, and benefits information. And you can see here, this was actually left on Maria's door, encouraging her to get those things. James C. Scott, in his book, Seeing Like a State, in the beginning, characterizes the modern state as dependent on the legibility of its citizens. For a state to accomplish its goal of enumeration, of statistics, of management of the population, it requires legible subjects. Here, legibility becomes a metric of value. For Maria, her progress towards acquisition of these documents became a yardstick for her responsibility. Caseworkers would scold her when she missed appointments and ask her if she even cared about herself when she failed to procure certain documentation. It became a central goal for both of us to pursue these materials as we navigated the Kafkaesque maze of bureaucratic institutions together. I still struggle to wrap my head around the fact that the state generates these documents themselves, yet also runs the programs that mandate their acquisition. Couldn't they just easily provide them without the rigmarole of people with physical disabilities having to physically go to all of these sites? But these were the belongings that mattered most to caseworkers and other Insight staff, the materials that made her legible to the state and to the entire system of the program. Physical and digital documentation does serve as both malleable objects through which discipline can be justified, but also as evidence for exoneration and proof of personal responsibility. Michel Lencioni, in his book, For a Liberatory Politics of Home, reveals that the well-documented failures and contradictions of housing services, such as transitional housing, are predetermined by the foundational logic of settler imperialism from which they are constructed. A truly liberatory politics of home requires then an abandonment of the idea of property as home, and the mobilization of alternative conceptions of what home could be. Scholars have noted that this project is always already underway by embattled communities in defiance of the paradigm of property and citizenship. And this project joins these scholars in focusing attention not just on the impact of geopolitical realities on individuals, but perhaps more importantly on how these individuals themselves participate in or refuse these realities through their relationship to their material realities. I hope I have given a convincing overview of how these projects of discipline and resistance converge on the particular side of material belonging. I think it's important that we pay attention to the ways that ideology manifests through material objects, how relationships and possibilities are facilitated or contested through the management of things. I leave you with this incredible piece of art that has nothing to do with materiality, but is nevertheless an important expression of resistance. And I think every mentor that I've ever had, including many in this room, as well as the tireless unhoused organizers in the communities, and I'm deeply grateful to the Sidewalk Project for their continued support and all the work that they do. Thank you.
A little time for questions.
There's time for answers too. I think we do. This is really interesting and really cool seeing how your work is kind of has evolved over the last year. I was wondering with the bureaucratic form making, but also the like interpersonal methods of enforcing these bureaucratic stuff. I'm wondering what you're how you're encountering or how you're conceptualizing the idea of the state, especially to people who are like saying like the state is coming. I noticed in when I'm talking to people who have been swept or who have encountered insidescape specifically, they say like, I won't talk to the state, or when I talk to these people, it's different than talking to the state. Yeah. And really the state means a nonprofit organization who has a form from the state that has the word government of Los Angeles County on it, but it's actually someone who's not employed by the state, nor is someone who conceptualizes themselves as the state. I'm wondering if you're running into this idea of the third party state, the associational state, as some people are writing it. And if you feel, for one, do you feel like this is sort of productive of this thing that is the nonprofit state? Or a tough question to answer besides yes or no, but
I think you're totally true that this is part, I think that's really true that this is part of like the NGOization process of like neoliberal retrenchment of social services. And I think this it speaks to the why LASA was defunded. I think given that, because it's, I think the main criticism that was applied to LASA wasn't that it wasn't achieving its goals, but that it was misappropriating and misusing funds. And I think that draws on the narratives, the like anti-corruption, like government can't do things right narratives. And one of the things that I heard from folks, and this is just individual actors that are part of these systems, but what I heard from some folks was that part of the logic was that, oh, these nonprofits know their community best. And so like, why have LASA be the arbiter of all of these programs when you could just directly interface with a nonprofit? And I think as anybody who's ever worked with these large nonprofits have experienced, they are not close, they're not experienced near to their clients. And I feel, and that's what's interesting too, is some of the motels and hotels that I've been to are not big enough really to have as much of a presence of some of these large nonprofits, but the really big ones, like the ones like Marsden that I talked about, are essentially run by like the Weingarten, people considered by these large nonprofit institutions. And I think it is true, like, in talking about the state and its representatives, I am referring to these organizations, which honestly feel at this point to be, I don't know, I guess it's uneasy to think about like, how do they articulate with the state in this way? But I think you're right, like you're pointing to something that I think that other people identify, the participants themselves, that this is all just part of the same project.
But you aren't.
But I'm not the state. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, that's another interesting thing too, is that I was like, I wear this badge, my medical student badge, to get through these facilities and nobody ever questions it. But then I like, somebody like just recently was like, do you work here? I was like, no. But it's interesting. And it's interesting the way that participants themselves identify those who are like part of the more ancillary, like USC Street Meds who come in and out, like all of these other different organizations that come in and out, as from the more the ones who like run the programs. Yeah. I don't know if that was a good answer. Yeah.
That was so excellent, Jack. Thank you for sharing that with us. I'm curious as to like historically where the obsession with surveilling quantity of material belongings kind of like was introduced or kind of like came to be. It seems like it's in tandem with like surveilling like the actual what people have, but where did this like specific like obsession with like these very like bureaucratic like two 60-gallon bags
Yeah,
come in?
specifically.
And then also how do other people experience or kind of talk about like that very specific like quantitative limit?
Yeah, I don't know. I will say that I'm not entirely sure about what the history of how that came to be. I will say that when you look up like what the size of like the typical garbage bin that we all get, like for folks who have housing that we wheel out to the thing, like on like average there's 60 gallons. So like there's like, not to draw direct like connections where there might not be, but I think that it does speak to the routine aspect of like, oh, this is trash. This is like fits within what could fit within a garbage bin, like a typical garbage bin. So like, this is what we can extend to what is allowable in the street. Again, I don't know if that's necessarily true, but when I looked it up, I was like, oh my God, that's actually it's striking how the similarity. And then I think to the second point of your question around how people think about this, I think it's become it's like really interesting because when you like sidewalk, for instance, we use garbage bags for when people need something to carry something. And I think it's a pretty ubiquitous reality that that garbage bags are the cheapest thing and the most accessible thing through which you can carry your stuff. And the same is true for like within the inside safe facilities. And one of the things that I didn't get a chance to talk about, but I think was really striking to me was that there's a young couple, a trans man and a young woman who like were told that they had to be transferred to one of the bigger inside safe facilities because theirs was closing, and they were told that they could bring all their stuff. But then when they got there, they were then subjected to that policy of like, oh, you could only have one 60-gallon garbage bag or 2 bags. And so they had their dad's wreath that they just got from their funeral. They had a bunch of cat stuff for their 4 cats that they owned. I had to help them kind of take a lot of that stuff kind of away. But then when I came back later, they had bagged the rest of the stuff in these bags and had put like in the same kind of garbage bags that were there, and had put like the names of the people on the bags, but crucially put the dead name of one of the people in the couple. And I think that doesn't really answer the question, I think, of like how people conceptualize it, but I think it does speak to the callousness or like or even maybe even not callousness, but bureaucratic indifference of and how these systems kind of are not conceptualized, like they're centered around different priorities.
I think we're out of time.
Okay.
I think we're out of time.
Okay.
Thank you, Jack.